time began. Long hours since the last light of day cast webbings of shadow over this goggly hillside. Everywhere there is rain, an oppressive rain that seems to swallow all sound and replace those normal sounds of twilight with a kind of hollow an echo of many things, of other times in the same place, of other men, other Eves. One man, a man become legend, a man whose name is whispered by those weary, a man whose name is Dracula. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Comic Beyond Dark Tales. In this episode, we're going to be covering Tomb of Dracula #1 from Marvel Comics. So, what's interesting about this comic is it came out in the 70s when Marvel had the idea of doing monster type books like Werewolf by Night, Monster Frankenstein, and of course, Tomb of Dracula. And all this came around the same time as like the Hammer horror films got popular with Christopher Lee playing Dracula. And so even his design in this book is kind of reminiscent of those movies with Christopher Lee, which are some of my favorite Dracula movies. So also being said that in the 70s you had Blade that was introduced in a Tomb of Dracula book, which we'll be covering on the show soon. But our story takes place in Transylvania, where three people are in a car and they're trying to get to Castle Dracula, as we'll soon find out. But they're driving in this thunder rainstorm, and they blow a tire, and so they end up having to like trek it in the storm to the small village on the way. And they stop at like a bar slash pub place to try to find somebody that'll like take them to the castle, like take them the rest of the way. And everybody's kind of weary once they walk in. Everybody just kind of gets quiet and turns their head and looks at them. And so our characters is Frank, Gina, and then Clifton, which Clifton is best friends with Frank, and Frank is dating Jenny. And so we learned that Clifton and Jenny had actually been dating prior to them taking this trip. And then they fell out of it, they stopped, and then Jenny ended up falling for Frank. So within the story now, Jenny is with Frank. So they get to this, and those are our characters. So they get to this pub. Everybody's hesitant. Everybody's telling them you don't want to go to that castle. Like, just don't do it. It's evil. And the barmaid, she's going along with them. She's like, "Oh yeah, you're just scared. You don't want to go to this castle." Finally, one of the patrons, Otto, they called him, says, "I'll take you up there in my carriage, but there's going to be a fee." So Frank steps up and he's like, "It's okay, we got money." And so he agrees to take them. And so we kind of flash forward back at this point in the story, and you find out that Frank, he's actually spent all of his inheritance money. So all the money that his parents had left him, he's spent it all. The only thing he got left to him in his will is this old castle, which after doing research, him and Cliff find out that it belonged to Dracula, like it's Castle Dracula. So since Frank's broke, Cliff gives him the bright idea, we'll go to the castle and we'll turn it into like a museum or a tourist attraction, and we'll make a bunch of money off of it. But first we gotta get there and we gotta see what we're dealing with. And so we flash forward and then by then they've gotten to Dracula's castle, and so they get there, and then they all decide to split up. So Frank and Jenny, they go and search other parts of the house, and Cliff, he wanders off on his own. Well, he ends up falling through like this trap door into like the dungeon, like a dungeon area that they didn't, in their research, they didn't know was there. And so while in this dungeon, Cliff finds Dracula's tomb. And so if you've ever watched any of the old Dracula movies, the Christopher Lee ones or Bela Lugosi from Universal Monsters, you know at the end, Van Helsing stakes him in the chest, kills Dracula at the end of the movie. So that's pretty much what the gist is here. Like, Cliff finds out, he opens the tomb, and there's a skeleton remain, but there's a stake sticking out of his chest. So it's almost like if you were to watch either one of those movies and then read this book, it's just kind of like a fun little follow up coming off of that canon. And so, not really thinking, Cliff removes the stake. Well, while he's down there in the dungeon, he's examining the tomb and all that kind of stuff. In his monologue, you find out that Cliff actually went with freaking Jenny to the castle with different intentions. So he's thinking while they're there, and this place already has a reputation of being evil, he's gonna kill Frank. He wants to murder Frank and take over rights to the castle, and he wants to take Jenny back. He wants Jenny back. So his whole plan for going with Frank wasn't just to help him set up this museum in the castle. He wants to take the castle, so he wants to murder his friend. So while his back's turned and he's looking around, he doesn't realize by pulling the stake out of the chest, he's actually resurrecting Dracula. So Dracula comes back. Frank tries to fight him off. He has a gun with him. He tries to shoot Dracula, but it doesn't do anything. So Dracula kills Frank. He ends up feeding off of him, and the next thing you know, like, Dracula's back. He's like full formed at this point. So Dracula ends up hearing the voice of a woman, and it's Jenny. So he's intrigued. He's like, it's been a long time since I've heard other voices in my castle. So he turns into a bat and flies his way out of the dungeon, and then he ends up coming across and finding Frank and Jenny. He turns back into Dracula, and he does his little stare that he does, like to where he hypnotizes people, and he gets into Jenny's head trying to lower her to him, and so Frank, pushes her down, gets her out of his sight in order to help her, and he tries to fight Dracula because he ends up getting Jenny's like silver makeup container, and he's waving it at Dracula. So finally, he tosses it at him, and it being silver and old Dracula mythology, like silver, just bad for Dracula. And so Dracula's like, with that, you might have got rid of me this time, but I'm not easily one to get rid of, so I'll be back for you, and especially Jenny. And so he does. Frank ends up like laying Jenny down in one of the rooms. Dracula comes to her, and by the time Frank gets to her, he's fighting him off again. He has Jenny's crucifix, and he has the silver makeup container. Well, by then, like the townspeople show up, and they're saying, "Oh, you've brought evil back or whatever. You've brought Dracula back." So they're attacking the castle. It's on fire. Um, so Dracula bails, and so Frank tries to get Jenny out. She's unconscious or whatever because of the trance, and he gets Jenny out or whatever, and he tells the people of the town, Dracula's gone. He's not here. So the castle's on fire. Jenny and Frank are outside, and she's unconscious. Well, to him, he thinks she's dead, and he didn't know that Dracula actually. There's a twist. He didn't know that Dracula had gotten to Jenny prior to him coming back to her room. So the twist is, Dracula actually turned Jenny into a vampire, and so she gets up and Frank's saying, "Oh, I've lost the woman I love," and this and that. Now she's a creature. She's a monster or evil. And so we end up going back to the village before the book ends, and the barmaid that was there, that was like instigating the tavern people or whatever when they showed up for help, comes across Dracula. Dracula comes in the bar and feeds on her, turns her into a vampire, and then the book ends. So that was like the first issue of Tomb of Dracula that Marvel had produced. I really like the story because it's self-contained. Honestly, if it just ended up being one issue, it would have been a fine one and done. Um, I left out some details just because they were just kind of like filler details. Like one was Frank had a book on Dracula lore and all that stuff that was also passed down to him for generations along with the castle. Um, and so I think it made it for a really good Dracula story. I like the way they brought him back. That was very simple. It wasn't convoluted. I like that Cliff got his comeuppance because he was like the bad guy of the story besides Dracula. Um, Frank was an interesting character. The twist of Jenny being turned into a vampire and Frank not knowing it till the last minute. Thought that was a good twist. I like how we go back to the barmaid and Dracula shows up. And so there was a lot of good like horror Dracula themed aspects to the story that I really enjoyed. I want to read more of Tomb of Dracula. Unfortunately, they're books that are hard to contain or obtain. I only got to read this because it was in one of my trades. So, but issue one is a great issue. I think there are reprints of issue one out there. So if you can get your hands on it, I would definitely check out issue one of Tomb of Dracula. Even if you can't read any other stories, at least this one is basically a one and done. Dracula's still out there, and he becomes a bigger presence in the Marvel universe later on, which I want to cover some more of those stories. He even goes up against Doctor Strange at one point. But that being said, definitely check out Tomb of Dracula #1. I know I made mention of like the Christopher Lee Hammer Dracula movies. I would definitely check those out if you're a horror fan or a fan of old horror. Check those movies out. And if you like this episode, please like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll talk to you later.